Good morning, Year 7. Hopefully you were able to find this SharePoint link okay and log on, and you can now hear me just fine. My name is Mrs. Welton. I will be recording the lesson for this week, or the lessons indeed. Some of you may know me, some of you may be taught by me, some of you may have seen me in the Year 7 area on a Tuesday when I have my duty. Either way, we're going to be working through Lesson 1 together today. You need to be writing down the title, Lesson 1, whatever today's date is. I am doing this on Sunday the 10th of January, for instance. You need to make sure you have a pen and paper available. However, if you'd prefer to do this on a Word document, that's absolutely fine. You could do it on that instead. Now, you shouldn't need to spend too long on this, but I'd like you to just spend a quick couple of minutes. What do you know about Shakespeare? Now, you should have done a leaflet last week on him, so just pause the video at this point, or just escape out of the PowerPoint so it doesn't auto-play to the next one, and make a few bullet point notes, anything you remember from the leaflet that you did about Shakespeare last week. One of the things that we didn't really touch on last week for the leaflet was the Elizabethan era. Now, it's called the Elizabethan era because it's named after the monarch that's on the throne at that point. In this instance, Queen Elizabeth I. Now, obviously, we have Queen Elizabeth on the throne at the moment, technically Queen Elizabeth II, but we only call her Queen Elizabeth, or Queen Lizzie, some people very informally call her. She was on the throne from 1558 to 1603. She was one of the strongest female monarchs of the time. Midsummer Night's Dream was written in 1595, which is why it's called an Elizabethan play, because it was written and released whilst Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. Now, she did die, and there was a different king on the throne in the second half of Shakespeare's life and during his writing times. But we're not going to cross that bridge at the moment. But it's just so that you know that there are some plays that you might hear aren't from the Elizabethan era. That's because the monarch changed in Shakespeare's life. As a quick little note to see if you can remember, what era did Charles Dickens write in? So Shakespeare wrote with Queen Elizabeth on the throne. Can you remember who was on the throne whilst Charles Dickens was writing, and therefore what that era was called? Your next task then, I would like you to pause the video, or again escape out of the PowerPoint so that it doesn't autoplay the next slide. I'd like you to pop these periods of history into order for me, please, starting with the oldest. So which do you think came first in our history of our world, all the way up until today for me, please? So what you should have in terms of your answers, the oldest part of it was the dinosaurs, because obviously the dinosaurs were millions and millions of years ago. Followed by ancient Egypt, they were thousands of years ago, 2000 BC if memory serves me correctly. Followed by the Romans, they were the ones that were more recent than that. Unfortunately, I don't know their date off the top of my head. Followed by the Elizabethan era, which is what we looked at for the 15 to 1600s. Followed by the Victorian era. This is one for Charles Dickens. This is the 1800s, because Queen Victoria was on the throne. Followed by World War II, which happened in the early 1900s. Finishing with your lifetime, which obviously is now in the 2000s. And then this is the one that we're looking at specifically for Shakespeare, right in the middle. And as I said, Charles Dickens, Victorian era. So we're going to do a little bit of reading to do with Shakespeare's early life. Now, I've attached this to your Show My Homework piece, which your teacher should hopefully have shared. So if you would like to, you can get your own copy beside you. However, I have copied the information onto the next couple of slides, so you can also just read along on the next few slides if you'd prefer. However, if you would like to reread it later, or you'd like it for your own notes and so forth, it is attached to your Show My Homework titled Shakespeare's Early Life. So let's start with Shakespeare's early life. Shakespeare is one of the most famous and popular writers in the English language. People have read, studied, and enjoyed his play for over 400 years. You might already know some of them. He wrote Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and Othello, as well as many others. Some of them you may know without realising you know. So, for instance, The Lion King is very heavily based on the story of Hamlet, and The Lion King 2 is based on Romeo and Juliet. Their stories come up quite often in media, and you don't realise that they are until suddenly you watch it and think, oh, that's actually that Shakespeare play. His plays are funny, scary, sad, and exciting, and many people praise Shakespeare for his original and imaginative stories and characters. But Shakespeare was actually a bit of a thief. He took many of his ideas from the stories he studied when he was at school. Clearly, he was paying attention in lessons. This term, you're going to study one of Shakespeare's funniest play. It's called A Midsummer Night's Dream. You may well have done some reading on this last week already. You may have got yourself ahead for it. We're trying to find some different media copies that you can access to be able to view this yourself whilst at home. There is one that's going to be as part of your homework this week, which has a brilliant video from YouTube, from Cliff's Notes, which is about 7 minutes long to help you explain it. Before we start to read it and act it out, though, we are going to learn a little bit more about Shakespeare's life and education so we can find out what gave him the idea to write this play. Shakespeare's birth and early childhood. This bit should be a little familiar to you, so we won't spend too long on it. No one knows the exact date Shakespeare was born, as birth records weren't kept that long ago. However, we think he was born on the 23rd of April 1564. That's over 450 years ago. Now, the reason why most people accept that as a date is because that was when he was registered as being baptised, and usually it happened 3 days after a child was born. And so they see the baptism on the 26th, so they assume his birthday was the 23rd. It's also nearly 250 years before Charles Dickens was born. William Shakespeare's father was John Shakespeare, glovemaker, and his mother was Mary Arden, who was the daughter of an affluent land-owning farmer. Affluent there just meaning quite profitable. He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, a town in the middle of England, about 22 miles from Birmingham. When Shakespeare was born in 1564, the ruler in charge of England was Queen Elizabeth I. Because of this, we call the time in history the Elizabethan era, which is exactly what we were looking at earlier in the lesson. Shakespeare's education. Like his birth, there are no records of exactly where Shakespeare went to school. However, we think he probably went to a grammar school called the King's New School in Stratford-upon-Avon. The school is still open today and continues to call itself Shakespeare's School. In Elizabethan England, grammar schools were very strict and students had to work hard. The school day would usually start at 6 in the morning and continue to 5 in the evening. During the winter, school days were shorter, but they still ran from 7 to 4. They had to go to school 6 days a week, so students spent around 2,000 hours a year at school. That's twice the amount of time that students spend at school today. Next lesson, we're going to find out what Shakespeare learnt specifically whilst at school. And just at the bottom of the page there, you can see some examples from Warwickshire, which is the county Shakespeare grew up in, which means that Stratford-upon-Avon is within Warwickshire there, so you have an idea of geography. And that's an example picture of the grammar school that Shakespeare attended. Those types of architecture with the white panelled walls and the thick wooden panels is very telling of the time, and a lot of Stratford-upon-Avon still has this building style. You need to take a pause at this point. This is going to be a task that you need to complete. However, how you do it is up to you. We studied this last week to do with the leaflet, so you may not want to write them down. If you'd like to, that is absolutely fine, but if you want to just do it in your head to remind yourself, that's also fine. So you've got, when was Shakespeare alive? What do we know about Shakespeare's birth? And what was Shakespeare's school probably like? So either make a mental note to yourself or write it down on a piece of paper. Either way, you'll need to pause the video or escape out of the PowerPoint to stop the audio from auto-playing. These are the kind of answers that you may have come up with. You may have come up with 1564, or you may have come up with his exact birthday. You may have written down 450 years ago, or you may have come up with the Elizabethan era. In terms of his birth, you may have said something about it being in Stratford-upon-Avon, you may have said it being near Birmingham, you may have said it being within Warwickshire, you may have said that we know that Queen Elizabeth I was queen, obviously, when he was born, because he was born within the Elizabethan era. And then finally, for the school, you may have something about the fact he went to grammar school, was incredibly strict, demanded the students to work an awful lot, and that they probably spent about twice as much time studying within the school environment than we do now. So that takes us to the end of the first lesson. This one is just a quick whistle stop. I'd like you to just make a note which statements about Shakespeare's early life are correct. Is it A, Shakespeare's mother was called Elizabeth? B, Shakespeare spent more time at school than pupils today? C, Shakespeare lived in the Victorian era? D, Shakespeare's family was very poor? Or E, Shakespeare's family was affluent? So have an answer or answers in your head before the next slide, please. What you should have chosen there is B and E. Shakespeare spent more time at school than pupils today, and that his family were affluent. Now, if you'd like to, you can go straight on to the next lesson. I am going to be recording these back to back as far as I can, but you may want to take a break, you may want to go and do different work, you may have worked through the entirety of your English period, you may need to come back to this, it might be lunchtime, it's up to you. If you want to go away from it and then come back to it later in the week, that's fine, but also if you just want to do it back to back, that's also fine. So I will see you when you come back for lesson 2. And here we are for lesson 2. So you can see there's my thing, still me recording. I'm doing the whole week this week. It's Mrs. Welton, just as a reminder. Again, pen and paper needed for this lesson, unless you'd prefer to work electronically, in which case you could just have a device open or a Word document or an email and so forth, to be making notes on what we're going to be looking at today, which is the influences in Shakespeare's writing. Last lesson we looked at context. It was a lot to do with what you'd already done the week before, which is why we didn't spend very long on it. This lesson we're going to be looking more at where he got his ideas from. So similar to last lesson, we're going to be reading about life in ancient Athens. I have transferred this onto the PowerPoint slide, so we're going to sit and read through the slide information, but if you would like your own one, or you need to have it on a certain colour, then you can open up the document from Show My Homework titled Life in Ancient Athens, and you can change the background over, you can have it printed yourself, you can just have it for your own records, whatever works for you. But it will be on the next couple of slides for you to read from instead, if that's your preference. Life in Ancient Athens. What did Shakespeare learn at school? We know that Shakespeare went to a grammar school where students studied for very long hours. They studied a lot of maths, including arithmetic, algebra and geometry, and they had an extensive religious education. Now that's because they were heavily religious during that time, and so the idea of RE was considered one of the most important subjects in school. Shakespeare would have learned a lot about ancient Greece and Rome when he was at school, which is why Rome came up in the ordering last lesson. The ancient Greeks and Romans lived about 2,000 years before Shakespeare was even born. The Elizabethans really admired the ancient Greeks and Romans, even though they lived such a long time ago. The Elizabethans made their children learn about the ancient Greeks and Romans in school. So it's very similar to you studying Shakespeare now. It feels like it was hundreds of years ago, and you might think, well, what has this got to do with today's society? But it was very similar. People were always studying the history, even in literature and history and philosophy and so forth. We have to learn from our mistakes in the past, the ideas from the past and so forth. So we keep looking backwards in order to move forwards. Who were the ancient Greeks? The ancient Greeks and Romans were famous for lots of things. They had a lot of writers who wrote wonderful stories. The stories that they wrote about were not always true. These are called myths. So have you ever heard something called being a myth, like the Loch Ness Monster, or something being mythical, like unicorns, it means that it's something, sorry, unicorns aren't real, it means that something isn't real. It is made up and it's not a fact. Myths are ancient stories about magical and fantastical events. Greek and Roman myths are still popular today. Lots of them have been turned into films. For example, you might have seen the films Hercules, Troy, 300, Clash of Titles, Immortals, or Percy Jackson and the Olympians. All of these films are based on Greek and Roman myths. Like you can see on the left there, there's a Minotaur, which is the half man, half bull idea. There's a lot of different mythical animals that come from Greece, mostly Greek. There is some Roman as well, that really emphasises the imagination that they had, and a lot of them kind of stem from the religious element that they had as well. As well as important writers, they had clever mathematicians who made important discoveries. They had amazing artists who made striking pots. These pots often show everyday people creating things as a pastime. They thought that education was very important. In ancient Greece, men would regularly meet in grand buildings to discuss philosophy. So philosophy is just the idea of studying life and meaning and so forth. And then you had mathematicians like Pythagoras. Any of you that have already studied the Pythagorean theorem, or if you haven't, then you will do over the next few years, actually come from ancient Greece. So they created this and realised this thousands of years ago. They were very, very clever men. If any of you have seen the beginning of the Disney film Hercules, the muses are all on a pot when they're singing. That's like it says there, that's the sort of pot design you would see, especially around ancient Greek, where they would literally paint on things that were happening in order to tell stories. What was life like for people living in ancient Greece? Women were generally not educated and were expected to obey men. Society was very ordered and there were very harsh punishments for people who broke the rules. They put some criminals into a bronze statue of a bull, lit a fire underneath the statue, so that the person burned to death. So you can see that on the left there. It's a pretty horrific way to go. There's a good word there for severe, which we're going to come up to later. But yes, instead of hanging and so forth, they would just burn them inside of incredibly hot metal. And as it also says there, women were not educated and expected to obey men. Remember, it wasn't until the early 1900s that women, through the suffragette movement, were able to get the ability to vote and actually stand their ground and have more of an equal pegging with men in terms of their opinion, their lives, their jobs, and so forth. How did ancient Greeks influence Shakespeare? Shakespeare must have been paying attention when he was at school because he was influenced by the writers of ancient Greece and Rome. Some of Shakespeare's plays are about real things that happened in ancient Greece and Rome. Some of his plays are about myths from Greece and Rome. His play, Midsummer Night's Dream, is set in one of the most famous ancient Greek cities called Athens. It was known all around the world for its wealth and grand buildings, very similar to London in the Victorian era. If you think about Oliver Twist, and about population growth that happened and that people were coming to London because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the jobs that became available, because of the science that became available. Athens was very similar to that during the ancient Greek times. The people who lived in Athens were called Athenians. When we read the play, you will be able to see how Shakespeare presented Athenians and their culture. So using the last 3 slides, or indeed if you would prefer, you can go back to the paper copy which is attached to Show My Homework if you just want to have it open alongside these. You need to answer these 4 questions for me, please. And they need to be answered in full sentences. Number 1, in which era did Shakespeare go to school? Number 2, what talents and skills are the ancient Greeks famous for? Number 3, how were people in ancient Greece treated if they broke the law? Number 4, Shakespeare wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1595. When did he set it? So for number 4, all that means is there's a difference between writing and setting. So I could write a book now in 2021, but I could set it in World War II. And so that means that there's a difference between writing and set, the place that I want it to be. So that's what number 4 is although he wrote it in 1595, when was it set? And the extension there, What other examples can you think of where a writer has written about a different time to the one that they currently live in? So that's not to do with place, it's to do with time. So you're going to want to pause the PowerPoint at this point or escape out of the slide so it doesn't autoplay to give yourself the opportunity to write an answer to these 4 questions for me, please. These are the sort of things that you should have for your answers. Shakespeare went to school in the Elizabethan era, so the Elizabethan era is what we're looking for there. The ancient Greeks were famous for writing myths, making mathematical discoveries, creating art, specifically there you might have talked about the pots, and discussing philosophy. And again, there you might have given some examples of like Pythagoras. Number 3, they were treated very harshly with brutal punishments. You might have included the bull and described how they used it, or you might have talked about the treatment of women and that they weren't considered important enough to have an education. And for number 4, you should have said that although it was written in 1595, he set it in Athens, ancient Greece. Or you may have said a few thousand years beforehand. You may have researched and looked up the exact time that ancient Greece was in this power information. And then for what other examples can you think of where a writer has written about a different time to the one they live in? That could be a series of different things. That can be to do with film, that could come from video games, that could come from books, that could come from newspapers, that can come from short stories. There are many, many things that you may have come up with for that extension task, so I'll leave that one for you to know whether or not you've done it, because it's fairly simple to know if they've written it in one year but set it in another year, then the answer's going to be correct. So here's a couple of examples to help you with the extension task, or if you didn't do the extension tasks, you understand what that question 4 means specifically. We have Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them was recorded in 2016, but is actually set in 1926, so it's set 90 years before it was actually created. Or we've got Michael Morpurgo's Warhorse, devastating sad story that one, written in 2007 but happens in World War I between 1912 and 1918. Or Frozen was made in 2013, but the events are generally believed to have happened sometime in the 1840s around the Victorian era. So severe is a word that I spoke about very briefly earlier. Severe is when something is very strict or harsh for like a reason that you can't quite work out. So for example, Oliver was given a severe punishment for asking for more food, if you remember Oliver Twist from last term. The man went outside despite the severe weather conditions. That feels very similar to what it is at the moment. It's incredibly foggy, although it doesn't look icy out the window to me at the moment. If any of you have seen Spain and Madrid at the moment, they've got some pretty severe weather conditions, although they seem to be having great fun with snowball fights as far as I've seen. The boy was crying, but his injury didn't look very severe to me. Many of you, if you've got younger siblings or people in the house, will probably have seen this when a kid is bawling their eyes out over what seems like nothing, because they think it's severe, they think it's the end of the world, but you look at it and you're like, it's literally a paper cut, like that'll go away in a couple of minutes. So severe is when something seems incredibly strict or harsh. So I would like you to answer this question, trying to give specific examples. In what way or ways was ancient Athens severe? Now, we went through Shakespeare's Education, and then we have the Life of Ancient Athens. You can use either of those documents from last lesson or from this lesson. Again, they are attached to show my homework, or you can go up in the slides and you can find it again to be able to reread it. And I'd like you to write me a short answer, possibly no more than about 3 or 4 lines, just briefly explaining to me, with specific examples, what kind of things did ancient Athens do that showed severity in their behaviour. There's a sentence starter at the bottom there if you'd like it. Ancient Athens was severe because. So you need to just pause the video at this point or escape out of it, write a paragraph. I will go through an example start in about 10 seconds time to give you the opportunity to pause, go away, check. But if you are then struggling, you can come back, you can listen to the opening section and then try again. So an opening that you could have is ancient Athens was severe because criminals were killed in brutally painful ways. Now, in order to extend that, what you might want to do is go back and have a look at some of the ways that they were punished. And if you want to extend it even further, you can do some of your own research here. See if you can find some other ways that the Greeks would punish the criminals that had done wrong. Or perhaps you could look at what kind of mythological, in order to tie it into what we're doing in a minute, what kind of mythological punishments were put into place as well. So, for example, putting them in a maze and forcing them to find their way through it, even though there's a minotaur there. So, we've looked at some of these elements. I would like you to now make some notes. You need to write down 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Beside each of them, write down how these images relate to ancient Athens. So ancient Athens is the setting for A Midsummer Night's Dream, the play that we're going to be reading. So to help you out a little bit, number 1, that is a picture of ancient Athens. So what do we know about ancient Athens? Number 2 there, is a gladiator and a fighter. So you can have a little bit of a look through what we've read or your own Googling information. Number 3, you've got pottery and the creation, and you've also got someone being educated on the rightmost side there. Number 4 is a black and white picture of the golden bull for punishment. And number 5, that's a group of people who are philosophizing. So they are discussing life and choice, religion, and so forth. So how is philosophy important to ancient Athens? So what you need to do is just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You're going to want to pause the video or escape out of the PowerPoint and just pop a note down next to each of them. What do we know about ancient Athens based on each of those pictures, please? You should have something like number 1, ancient Athens was known all around the world for its wealth and its grand buildings. So the fact that they were incredibly strong, wealthy, they were moving up in the world. Greek and Roman myths have been turned into popular films, especially things like Gladiator, where they had to fight one another. It was a well-known pastime and people enjoyed watching them fight one another. You had artistry who made striking pots resembling what kind of things they would be doing during the time, such as musicians, education, fight scenes, and so forth. That could go back to number 2. Number 4, they had very severe punishments for people who broke the rules, including things like putting the fire underneath the golden bull so that they would slowly die a horrific death. And number 5, men would regularly meet to discuss philosophy. Women were generally not educated and had to obey the will of man. They had to do as they were told. For this task, you need to be deciding which of these events are myths and which are history. Now, all that means is you need to decide, is it a myth, so a fantastical story, a fantasy, something that's not real, something that's imaginary, or is it history, which is factual, true, something that really happened? So you need to pause the video at this point or escape out of the PowerPoint, and you need to be making a note 1 to 8 for me, and then beside each, myth or history. These are the answers that you should have. A woman is turned into a spider after she annoys a goddess is a myth. That is a well-known Greek story about a woman who was a better seamstress. She was better at making things. The goddess didn't like that there was a human that was better at looming. It's kind of like when they go in and out of strings. It's sort of like sewing, but on a big, I guess, canvas is the best word for it. She didn't like there was a human that was better at it than her, and so she turned her into a spider, which is cruel. Number 2 is history. Story of Hercules has been made into many films. Number 3, the ancient Greeks fought many battles is also history. It is true that they were doing a lot of fights. Number 4, Hercules is threatened by a dog with 3 heads is a myth. Obviously, a Cerberus is considered mythological. Dogs don't tend to have 3 heads. Even in Harry Potter, Fluffy is based on that Greek Cerberus dog. Number 5, Athens was an important city in ancient Greece with lots of beautiful buildings. Is a fact. It is history. You can still go and see some of those beautiful buildings that still stand now. 6, ancient Greeks and Romans lived about 2,000 years before Shakespeare. It's a fact. 7, Shakespeare set Midsummer Night's Dream in ancient Athens 2,000 years before he lived. Again, that's a fact. Number 8, a man annoys a god so much that his head is turned into a donkey's head. This one I don't know specifically, but it is something that also comes up in Midsummer Night's Dream. Small minor spoiler there. So to finish this lesson, what you need to do is to have a look at these statements and make a decision which ones are correct. A Midsummer Night's Dream is set in Athens at the time of Shakespeare writing. B, Midsummer Night's Dream is set in England about 2,500 years ago. C, Midsummer Night's Dream is set in Athens about 2,500 years ago. D, Midsummer Night's Dream is set in England at the time of Shakespeare writing. Or E, Midsummer Night's Dream is set in Rome about 2,000 years ago. So, which of these answers are correct? Hopefully you realised it was only C. Only C is the one that is correct. It was Midsummer Night's Dream was set in Athens about 2,500 years ago. So that takes us to the end of the second lesson. If you'd like to, you can go straight on to the third lesson, same as before, or you can take a break. It's up to you. Welcome to lesson 3. I don't know if you're continuing this straight on or if you've decided to take a break, but welcome back regardless. Same as before, you need to have the title and date written down, but obviously write down the date that you are actually doing the work. For the lesson, you're going to need a pen and paper in order to write on. However, what you might want to do is instead do it in a Word document. As always, however you complete these notes and ideas is up to you, but you don't need to send these notes to your teacher. The homework is what you need to be sending in, which I'll come to at the end of the lesson. So the first lesson this week we looked at Shakespeare's life and the context to do with that. The second lesson this week we looked at Greece and we looked at Romans and we looked at what influenced Shakespeare, specifically the Greeks for the Athenian attitude for Midsummer Night's Dream. For this lesson we're going to be looking at the different roles that are available during the Elizabethan times. We're looking at the sort of jobs that were around whilst Shakespeare was writing. So similar to one of the previous tasks in a previous lesson, I'd like you just very quickly for you to do now to put these periods of history into the correct order for me, please. Go from oldest to most recent. As an extension, you may want to be making a note of which one of these is Midsummer Night's Dream set in, and what do you remember about what that period of time was like. So you need to just pause this or back out of the PowerPoint so it doesn't autoplay the next one. What do you know about these parts and can you put them into the correct order? What you should have is ancient Greece was first, about 2,500 years ago, followed by the Roman Empire, about 2,000 years ago, followed by the Elizabethan era, about 450 years ago, the Victorian era, about 150 years ago, and then today, which is today. And then we're looking at Shakespeare, who wrote in the Elizabethan era about 450 years ago. And then we've got Dickens, who we looked at with Oliver Twist last half term, in the Victorian era.
I woke up at 6 from the noise of bells ringing outside.
Listen to the story
I was
of
late
the
for
day
work.
in the life of a groundling.
I work as a
Now,
scullion on the other side of town, and I'd already been late twice that week. I didn't have time to have something to eat, normally just some old bread and cheese, so I was starving by the time I got to work.
So if you can't hear it
The cook was not pleased to see me. He
you
knew I
can't
was late,
understand him
and
very
he gave me a
well,
real
or you
telling
want
off
to
for being
make
late
some
again.
notes, from
He said
what he's
today was
saying,
my
you
final
can use a
chance.
transcript
If I
from
was late
Show My
once
Homework
more,
titled
he'd kick me
A
out.
Day in the Life
That
of
was
a
the last thing I
Groundling.
needed.
Whilst
I only
listening,
earned a
you need to
penny
be
a day as
making
it
notes
was,
on
so
what
losing
kind of
this job
jobs
would be a
were
disaster.
available during that time,
I got
what kind
working
of food was
immediately,
available,
cleaning all the
what kind of
pots and pans and
healthcare
plates
was
and breakfast,
available,
and
or
washing the
how
floor.
healthy were people,
The estate I work
what
on
kind
is
of
huge,
entertainment
and
was
there's a
there,
large
what sort of
family
things
living
could they
here.
do for
They're known
fun.
for miles
Now,
around
how
for
you do
being
this is up to
gluttons,
you. You might
so
want
they
to do
get
these as
through a
subheadings,
lot
you
of
might want to
food.
do these as a table,
They can
you might
afford
want to
it,
do it
so
as a
they can eat
mind
what they
map.
like.
It's up
but
to
it
you.
means more washing
You
and
can listen
cleaning
to this
for
a
me.
couple of times if you'd like
By
to.
11 o'clock, I could barely
you should
stand.
be able to
That's how
click
hungry
on
I
the
was.
audio yourself,
I
or
saw
as
the
I
page
said,
come down and
you've
start
got the
bringing all the
transcript and Show
delicious
My
food for
Homework
lunch up
if
to the
you're not
lords.
able to hear all of it at
Stewed
once,
trout,
and you want to go through it
boiled
again
pigeons,
at your own pace.
calves' tongues. It all looked so good. There was nothing for it. I waited until the cook had his back turned, then I tried to sneak some off the plate and into my empty stomach. But I wasn't careful enough. "Oi! What do you think you're doing?" Cook yelled. Then, fast than you can peel a carrot, he picked up a pan and threw it straight at my face. It hit me right in the mouth, and my 2 front teeth smashed immediately, and blood started gushing everywhere. "Get out of here! Don't you come back!" Cook screamed. I ran out as fast as I could, looking for my teeth on the floor as I went. It hadn't been a great morning, but I knew I had to get to the barber quickly to get my teeth looked at. I'd been to the barber before, but that was just for the occasional haircut, maybe around Christmas when I might have had a little more money. I'd seen the barber work on people's teeth before, and it looked terrible. He looked like he was just making it up as he went along, if I'm honest, but I didn't really have much else of a choice, did I? An hour, a lot of screaming, a half-gallon of ale, and 3 shillings later, I left the barber. After the most miserable morning of my life, I decided what I really needed was some entertainment. I headed over the Thames to Southwark, which is where you have to go to have a good time in London. I decided to see a play first, and luckily it was a comedy rather than a tragedy. I don't think I could have stood seeing a miserable play, and the one I saw was pretty ridiculous, with a fairy king and queen and a talking donkey. I might be ugly with my new horrible teeth, but at least I don't have a donkey's head. After some bear baiting and a cockfight, I decided to go home. It was getting dark, and I wasn't looking forward to having to find a new job in the morning. I doubted anyone would employ me. I'm 33 and far, far too old to think about training in a new job. If I'm lucky, I might live to 50. But I'll have to avoid the plague and dysentery, and goodness knows how many other unknown sicknesses. But just as I was having these terrible thoughts, I was overwhelmed by the most awful smell. It was truly unbelievable and indescribable. "Watch out!" a voice cried behind me. "Gong farmer coming through!" "Wait a second," I rasped. "Wait!" I took the man's shoulders in my hands. "Have you got any work? I've just lost my job, and I'm looking for something to do. I hate early mornings, and I know you only work at night." "We've always got work going as a gong farmer. Not too many people want to wander the streets tonight, up to their necks in urine and excrement, and cart it around the city. When can you start?" I thought for a moment, and realised I had nothing better to do. "Pass me that bucket. I'll get started tonight."
So again, if you'd like to, you can use the transcript itself from Show My Homework if you didn't get all of the notes done, or you can restart this slide and you can listen to it again. So you need to be making notes about what kind of jobs were available, what sort of treatment did they have whilst at jobs, what sort of food was available, you'd be the poor and the rich there, and what sort of healthcare was available in terms of how were they looked after, how were they treated, how did he get his teeth fixed, that kind of idea, and also what sort of entertainment was there, what did he do in order to have fun. Now, severe is a word that we looked at last lesson. I'd like you to decide which of these statements show that life was severe for some people living in the Elizabethan era. Was it A, when he said, "I woke up at 6 from the noise of bells ringing outside"? Is it B, when he said, "They get through a lot of food. They can afford it so they can eat what they like, but it means more washing and cleaning for me"? Or is it C, "Then faster than you can peel a carrot, he picked up a pan and threw it straight at my face"? So I'd like you to just take a second here and decide which of these shows that it was severe for some people in the Elizabethan era, A, B, or C. Hopefully you found the word C, because obviously just because he was stealing a little bit of food because he was starving, the cook threw a pan at his face and actually knocked out some of his teeth, which he then had to go and pay to repair. So hopefully it was C that you picked there. Okay, so we've been given some information about groundlings. I'd like you to just think about, what do you think the word groundling means? So a groundling was a person who visited the Globe Theatre in the early 17th century, was too poor to be able to sit on one of the 3 levels of the theatre. Hopefully you were doing the Globe Theatre competition that Miss Calloway set last week, in which case you'll know that there were sitting spaces on the outside of the Globe Theatre and a big open space at the bottom. It is that place that the groundlings would stay in, because it's on the ground, obviously. By paying 1 penny, they could stand in the pit, also called the yard, just below the stage to watch the play. The pit didn't have a roof. This meant that the groundlings would get wet if it rained during a play. Standing in the pit was uncomfortable, and people were usually packed in tightly, because obviously they were the poorest people. They didn't care about them very much. So what they would do is they'd just get as many people in as they could to stand in that circle by the stage, which was quite good because it meant you were right next to the stage, but not because you'd have to stand for usually about 2.5 hours with no roof and then in the mud, but it was one of the only entertainments that they had available to them. The groundlings were commoners, and who were also referred to as stinkards and penny stinkers, because obviously they would smell. And it would be from the rich people who would say, "They're disgusting, stay away from me, I'm going to sit on my lovely seat underneath my roof on the outside circle." So if you'd like to, you may want to make some notes based on what that slide says, in order to understand the groundlings, where they stand, and the difference between the rich and the poor. Okay, so at this point what you need to do is use the notes, the ideas from the last slide about the groundling, and what we got from the transcript and the man speaking on the slide before. And I'd like you to write 2 paragraphs for me, please, that you need to send to your teacher. What was life like for a groundling in Elizabethan London? Now you could be writing about the jobs, health, food and entertainment. Within the entertainment is when you can be talking about the Globe and about staying on the ground area, it being a penny to get in and so forth, having to stand, having no roof, etc. So you're just writing 2 paragraphs for me, please, that just shows that you understand what it was like for a groundling in Elizabethan London. You need to be checking for your capital letters and full stops, your run-on sentences, every proper noun. So like Elizabethan and London should be capital E and capital L. Shakespeare should be a capital S, and so forth. Groundling, though, is a little g. And you need to make sure that you're getting the spelling of groundling and Elizabethan correct. So what you need to do is you need to be writing up any notes to do with Elizabethan London for a groundling for this lesson and send it to your teacher, please. You should be aiming for about 4 or 5 lines per paragraph, so about 10 lines total. That's if you are handwriting it. It's slightly different if you're typing it. You're probably only looking at about 2 or 3 lines. So we're not looking for an awful lot written during this, it's just to show a consolidation of ideas. If you'd like to write a little more, you can, but it's only this that you need to send, not your notes for the previous parts of the lesson, because we'll check to make sure that you've understood and applied it in the following weeks as we start to study Midsummer Night's Dream. So you need to pause it, escape out the PowerPoint and so forth, so give yourself the opportunity to write your answers here. And in finishing it, which of these statements are true? A. In the Elizabethan era, life was easy for poor people. B. In the Elizabethan era, only rich people could afford to go to the theatre. C. In the Elizabethan era, you could go to the theatre for free if you were a groundling. D. In the Elizabethan era, the people who bought the cheapest tickets to the theatre were called groundlings. E. In the Elizabethan era, poor people could afford to go to the theatre, but they didn't bother because only rich people could understand what was going on. So, you may need to pause it for a second whilst you make a decision. Which of those are correct? Hopefully you found D there is the only one that's correct. Life was not easy for a poor person in any capacity. They had to work incredibly hard to get anything. It wasn't only the rich people who could go to the theatre. The rich people were the only ones who could afford seats and a roof, but you could get in as a groundling, which takes us to C. It did, however, cost you a penny, though. It was not free for you to get in. D is true. The cheapest tickets available were for groundlings. But E is not true, because Shakespeare would write to a variety of different audiences. There were some jokes that were specifically made and characters created for poor people to be able to understand. There is some more poetic speeches and so forth, which are Shakespeare's most known speeches, that the rich people were more likely to understand. However, the entirety of the plays weren't created just for rich people. There were jokes and sections and characters in for poor people to go and understand and enjoy as well. So your only other task for this week is to have a look for a quiz that should look a little like this. This is one that I've set for my group. There's a resource attached at the bottom. I recommend that you use that resource beside the quiz if you can, in order to help you answer the questions. All it is just taking you through what the story of A Midsummer Night's Dream is about, and then you're answering questions, just comprehension questions. Who loves this person? What happens here? What is this person doing? So you don't have to memorise it. You can have the document open whilst you're answering the questions. There's no time limit attached to it, so you can take as long as you need to find the questions. You have 3 attempts total to try it. There are 26 questions on this quiz. There's also a hyperlink there for a video about Midsummer Night's Dream, about 7 minutes long. I spoke to you about it earlier from Cliff's notes. I think it's brilliant. It's a great version of Midsummer Night's Dream, very condensed, to be able to tell you the entirety of the story in some capacity. There's also a stretch and challenge there for those of you who should be stretching and challenging yourself. Once you finish doing this PowerPoint, once you finish doing the plot quiz, you can be making some notes to send to your teacher. Do you think the ending of Midsummer Night's Dream is happy or not? Do you think Demetrius's love is real? Why or why not? And is it fair to leave the potion in Demetrius's eyes at the end? Why or why not? Now, if you are doing that stretch and challenge, you shouldn't be just sending in 1 or 2 sentences. There should be a good paragraph for each of them at least, where you're developing your ideas and pushing yourself to be really thinking in detail about what Shakespeare was trying to convey, what he was trying to say. You should know whether or not that applies to you and one of the people that should be challenging yourself. But basically, all you need to be sending to your teacher for this week is the 2 paragraphs at the end of the lesson that we've just completed, and doing this plot quiz. As an addition, if you're doing the stretch and challenge, sending that as well. Hopefully that all makes sense to you. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening to me go through some context. Miss Divers is going to be doing next week, where she's going to take you through the first opening section of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I will be doing week 3 after that. If you do have any questions or unsureties, please do get hold of your teacher or get hold of me instead if you would prefer. It was nice to have spoken to myself in this room, but also spoken to you so you could hear, and hopefully you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Shakespeare. I will see you in 2 weeks.